Hi, everyone. Welcome to episode 49 of the Future of Work show. Now, I'm so excited that we've been having these conversations for 2 years, and so much has been evolving through those 2 years. We've had so many thought leaders come on the show and speak about, what the future of the workplace is going to look like, what the future of human and tech interaction is going to look like, and even what the future of leadership or other HR systems is going to look like. Now, I'm super excited because today I have with me Professor Gary Bolles. Hi, Gary.
Shalini, how are you?
Good, good, good. Delighted to have you on the show. Professor Gary Bolles is the chair of the Future of Work at Singularity University. And Gary, I don't know if I mentioned this to you, but I myself was, part of one of the chapters of Singularity in India.
Oh,
So
that's wonderful.
I just love the work that you guys are doing globally in helping, frankly, not just organizations, but so many of us make sense of a world that's changing faster than perhaps we can even write about it. Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah.
You
Yeah. Exponential
know,
change.
yeah, sometimes I feel that the moment we write a book, the year that it takes to write the book, so much shifts just within that year. So
Yeah.
it's really quite a challenge.
No, absolutely. No, I think we're all certainly in recent years we've all experienced exponential change with the global pandemic. So we all have our lived experiences clearly illustrating just how rapidly things can change.
Absolutely. So, Gary, I'm going to come to your book, The Next Rules of Work. And I have to say, one of the things I was fascinated by was that, it's the next rules of work, not the new rules of work. In
Okay.
fact, if I'm honest, and I'm going to share this with you, the first time I wrote the episode name, I wrote it as the new rules of work. Before I realized that no, it's the next rules. And I know in your book you speak a little bit about why that's so, but I'm sure our audience would love to hear what were some of your thoughts behind it.
No, absolutely. So I think we've been talking about new rules for work for quite some time. As a matter of fact, in the book, I show sort of three waves. The old rules, which are the industrial era rules, 9 to 5 jobs and 5 day a week work weeks and so on. Those are sort of the old rules that many of which we inherited from the industrial era. Then there were new rules that Silicon Valley companies and others were experimenting with. But then along comes a virus, and suddenly we're all learning a completely different set of rules. We're co-creating really what is coming next. And what we found is that over the years, helping people to continually anticipate what is coming next is the mindset that's most useful in being able to deal with exponential change.
It's interesting you say that, Gary, because one of the most common questions we get asked by leaders, and particularly by entrepreneurs, is how does one even do that? How does one track all that's changing in the environment and all that's changing inside? So, before we jump into the other topics we have, I'm wondering if you've been asked similar questions and if you've encountered lots of business leaders with just this concern. How do we even begin to track all that's happening around us?
So it's a constant conversation. I have the privilege of speaking to leaders in business, government, communities all around the world, and it's very consistent concern that the world seems to keep changing faster and faster. Each of us as individuals, our human minds, we're only able to deal with so much change, and then we get overwhelmed. And certainly, when it comes to organizations and constantly changing technologies, a variety of different global conditions, like constantly changing economic conditions, it does add up to quite a bit. And so that's why a lot of the discussion I have is around strategies for how each of us is able to deal with these changes. And I tend to talk about 4 domains: what happens to us as individuals, what happens in the context of organizations, what happens in the context of communities, and then finally, what happens in the context of countries and regions. And there are strategies for each to be able to not just respond or react to exponential change, but to actually leverage it and to be able to use next generation techniques and technologies to be able to get our arms around these changes and then to guide them to create a more human centric future.
Gary, it's so interesting you say that. Uncube's own framework looks at three ends of this triangle. The
Mm,
first is change externally. So, how do we track cultural trends, technology trends, just shifts in business ideas more broadly, shifts in ecosystems, all that's happening, the mega trends that are influencing the shifting sort of sands of the world we live in.
right,
And then the whole piece of what does it mean for organizations, what does it mean for
mm,
us to be able to respond to some of this. So what are the kinds of organizations, and that's what your book is all about. So what are the kinds of organizations which will have the capacity to respond to some of this? And then the third end of the triangle that we use is what does it mean for me personally, as
right,
a leader, as a professional, like what shifts for me? Because as you said, it isn't easy. We've all, particularly those of us who've had careers for a few decades, we've grown up with a very different orientation, and today's world requires almost a complete shift. um, so it's just interesting that this
right.
maps on so well to one of the frameworks that we use.
Oh,
So
that's
I'm
great.
going to come to an idea, Gary, that you speak about in your book. The idea that all work is a series of problems to be solved. Would love to hear more about this.
No, absolutely. So, my father was a recovering minister years ago who ended up writing the world's career manual, a book called What Color Is Your Parachute? And he came up with the idea that the insight that if you present yourself to a potential employer when you're job hunting as a problem solver, I understand your problems as an organization. I understand your customers' problems. I've solved these kinds of problems in my previous work, and here are examples where I've done that. If you present yourself as a problem solver, you are far more likely to get hired than the next person. And so I've applied this to a wide range of different ways we think about how we as humans perform our work. But I basically say, I think it ends up having sort of three different elements. It's a problem to be solved. How do we solve problems? We perform tasks. And then how do we perform tasks? We use our human skills. So that's kind of it. Human skills applied to tasks to solve problems. Now, the old rules of work, many people focus just on the tasks. You read a lot of job descriptions. It kind of says you'll do this, then you'll do this, then, and robots and software, they're very, very good at tasks. They're not very good at problem solving, and they certainly aren't good at developing new skills. So that's what differentiates us as humans. We can understand unique problems. We can encounter problems we've never seen before, and then we can use our human skills to be able to solve them.
One of the things I really like about that lens is it's such a good one to look at what it takes to create organizations that are fit for tomorrow. In essence, you're creating a series of systems using your terminology, the mindset, skill set, tool set for problem solving at a much higher, pace and a higher level of complexity than you or we have needed to, at least in the
Yeah,
last 150 years. So I really
yeah,
love
that's a
that.
great insight.
And for everyone who's joining us, I would like to share that Professor Gary Bolles' father is the author of the really well-known book that I'm sure you've all come across in bookstores across the years. What Color Is Your Parachute? Beautiful book. It's impacted so many of us in the way we look at careers and the way we look at work. So with that, actually, Gary, I'm going to come to something else you write about: careers as a portfolio of work. Could you say more to
Mhm.
that?
No, absolutely. So, I think that again, there's these traditional models, the old rules of work that many of us followed. Often a big chunk of learning or education at the beginning of our lives, and then a big chunk of work in the middle, and then a smaller chunk of leisure, and what I call the period formerly known as retirement. But what's ended up happening in a world of exponential change is certainly the traditional relationship between a worker and a hirer, or an employee and employer, has started to fray. I mean, people feel that they have much more mobility. We talk about the great resignation, not my favorite phrase, but certainly the idea that people can have more agency. And we talk about employers being able to make decisions to lay people off, or when there's a mismatch in terms of their business opportunity and their workforce, to make decisions to try to reduce that workforce. Well, what's ended up happening, I believe, is that young people know that this is a world of constant change. And what you see increasingly is that a young person comes out of high school, college, vocational school, and sure, they might get a day job, a traditional job, but then they're driving for Uber at night, and then they're working on a startup with their friends, and then they take a gap month with their friends. And parents ask me all the time, why won't my kid get a real job? Well, this is actually a hedge against a world of exponential change. A young person doesn't know what is actually going to create economic benefit and satisfaction for them going forward. So they often start to dabble in having these different aspects of different kinds of work. And if you look at that arc throughout a person's life, I call that a portfolio of work. Strongly related to it is a portfolio of learning, because, of course, the shelf life of information is so short nowadays that you need to continually to be a lifelong learner.
Um, how does that impact? And one of the other things you write about is that work is one form of expressing your mindset, skill set, tool set, but there are many others. So if you're a young person today, how do you even begin to think about careers, particularly when it's really hard to predict um, how any career or any set of job families is going to progress over the next even 5 years, I would say.
No, absolutely. So, first off, when we look at people who feel that they are getting the kind of success that they want in their work lives, there's a couple of common threads. The first is that there is some type of Southern Cross or North Star, some general direction that drives them. And that might be a deep curiosity. That might be a kind of problem they love to solve. It might be particular skills that they love to use. But there's something that serves as that kind of guiding star in their work that keeps them continually interested in wanting to grow and develop and to focus on solving problems. So that's the first one. The second is that people feel that they have agency. That is, that they can continually take actions that can have a positive outcome. And so you might in the past have stayed in the same dead end job for years or decades. You might in the past have simply accepted that work maybe is just work and doesn't give you a lot of satisfaction. But agency is the belief that you actually can find or create meaningful, well paid work. And so that's the second element that we think is incredibly important for, especially for young people, is that they feel they can have that ability to be able to either find work that exists that could actually spark their interests, or that they can create that either through developing, co-creating with a particular employer, or starting their own company.
Gary, do you think this has shifted through the pandemic?
So I think the pandemic has sort of laid bare a couple things. The first is that we as humans can change really, really rapidly, given the right combination of incentives and disincentives. If in January 2020, I had told you that we were all going to figure out how to do this distributed work thing in a matter of mere weeks, and that we would continue, many people would be able to continue to do their work, many organizations would be able to continue to deliver value to their customers, you might have said, well, you're crazy. That's not possible. Humans don't shift that quickly. And of course we did. So that's, I think, one of the main takeaways, is that we can change very rapidly. The other is that we told ourselves a lot of stories about what work is and work had to be. I call those the old rules of work. We had to be in the office. We had to be working there 9 to 5. It had to be 5 days a week. And then we realized, no, actually, a lot of those things aren't true either. We don't necessarily have to do that. Now, there's certain work that must be done on site. You can't deliver food to a table from remote, at least not really easily right now. But for the work that could be done more distributed, we realized that actually we can make work much more flexible. And so I think that's a tremendous takeaway. So long as we don't sort of bungee cord back to the way that we used to do things, now that we're starting to enter into a post-pandemic world.
I'm going to speak about something that you just referred to a moment ago, the idea that there's agency, and young people are realizing they have far more agency over their working careers. Do you think that aspect has shifted over the last couple of years?
Well, I think that's it. I think it varies pretty widely by culture, right? So there's no question that in economies where there's a lot of gig work on platforms like the Ubers and the delivery services, where you can find that work. And that gives you the flexibility to say, well, maybe I don't need a traditional job right now. I can simply make money for a period of time. Where that you have that luxury, you have that capacity, then I would say yes, that's pretty new. Uh, where I think one of the greatest potential challenges is that in many cultures there still is, for many parents especially, very strong encouragement to follow the old rules of work. Study the right thing in school, get the right degree, go into the right field. And the challenge is that there's a decreasing number of right decisions that would guarantee you're going to be doing the same kind of work in 20 or 30 years. And so I think that actually is, there's no question that younger people feel that they have more potential opportunities. But I think there is a dynamic tension, certainly for older workers and for parents, in trying to help them to be able to navigate that world. And unfortunately, they tend to fall back often into the old rules of work.
Yeah, it's interesting you say that because we have a question from my co-founder, Papia. Hi, Papia. She's asking, is there a differentiation between how different generations are wanting to experience work?
So I use a model in the book that many of your listeners may be familiar with, but I talk about sort of four steps in the process that people went through in the past of determining what kind of work they wanted to do and why they did their work. It starts off with, at the sort of bottom rung of the ladder, what you can get paid for. Then it's what you do well, because if you do it well, you'll get paid better. And then for some people, it's doing work that you love. Against one of my father's insights with What Color Is Your Parachute. And then finally, maybe when you were retiring and working in the local food bank, it's what the world needs. So what you can get paid for, what you do well, what you love to do, and what the world needs. And the old rules of work, you kind of work that your way up that ladder. And this is called ikigai, widely practiced in Japan and especially in Okinawa. Uh, but young people, I believe, are flipping that stack or that ladder. They're first asking, what does the world need? If I can do that, that's what I'll love. If I love that, then I'll get good at that. And I get good at that, then I'll eventually get paid well for it. Again, parents ask me, why won't my kid get a real job? Well, I think of this as more passion or meaning driven work. And you're finding that this is an era, there's a generation of young people that are coming up that know the world's problems. They can know what's going on in the mind of the leader of a country that's under attack halfway around the world 5 minutes after he thinks of it. And so because they've got all this information about the challenges in the world, I think we have a younger generation that's realizing that they need to step up to try to help solve some of those problems.
It's so interesting you say that, Gary, because our own organization, Uncube, does a lot of primary research as well. And we do commissioned research, primary research, and in many of our larger studies, we found very strong paddlers. One, we found that younger people just have a much greater sense of agency than previous generations ever had. So that's created this really interesting shift where like you said, what comes first has changed because they feel confident that livelihood will manage that'll follow. So what's an important problem for us to spend our time in life on? What is it that we really enjoy? The questions which perhaps many previous generations asked a lot further down in their careers, are being asked right up front. The other thing we found, and I want to hear whether this matches your own experience, is that ideas of work have sort of shifted generationally, and we find that people who've been working for 20, 30 years and beyond, uh, within that within that generation, there's a fairly widespread at this point between people who have a strong preference for traditional back to office kind of work, and people who have really enjoyed uh, remote work and want to continue in
Yeah.
that model, and almost everything in between. So with older generations, there's a fairly widespread now of what they're looking for, but amongst younger generations, the spread is pretty consistent. One of our recent studies found that almost 90% have a strong preference for flexibility in some form or the other. So I'm wondering if this is similar to what you found in some of your work too.
No, absolutely. So I think what's true about us as humans is that I call us trial and error machines. We sort of figure things out by testing things out. And then after a while, we get good at something. It's kind of easy to get kind of locked into it. And so I long before the pandemic, I used to show a slide during my talks of a horrible commute and a big cubicle farm. And the caption says, "Remind me when this was ever a good idea." But the truth is that for many people, that's kind of what they learned is those old rules of work, kind of industrial era sort of thing of going to the factory of the office or the workplace and being in a room with lots of people. And that's kind of what we all accepted. And that's what we learned. And because we learned that, and if we attain some level of success and income from doing that, we might think, well, that's the only way you can do it. There's the only rules you could follow. But young people, again, I didn't grow up in in an era where people have these I call these digital distraction machines. I didn't grow up in an era where young people are getting the message that there's so many different work opportunities in the recovery from the global pandemic, and so that should have a different impact on a younger worker. It should give them the message that you can have more flexibility. And the challenge for organizations is that they have to balance all those different use cases. You've got to balance this older mindset, typically older mindset, of people that are following the old rules of work. And then you've got this younger crowd that wants flexibility. And that can create a lot of dynamic tension inside an organization. But that's an opportunity to be able to build the kind of organization that can actually leverage the strengths of each. The older worker, or the one that has been trained in diving in deeply on different learnings and different arenas, can actually teach how you go towards mastery, because young people won't always get the memo that they need to actually really stick with something and go deep into it. And young people can help older workers or more traditional workers to be able to learn about flexibility, adaptability, leveraging technology to solve problems, and so on.
Gary, a lot of organizations we talk to are at a point where they're trying to design what the future workplace is going to look like. And the range is quite wide, from some which are far more traditional and are eager to go back to office and pre-pandemic, all the way to organizations which have very publicly taken stands that we will be largely remote and we will meet occasionally, and of course everything in the middle, different forms of hybrid, right from how many days in office to the frequency of meeting, or even what triggers in-person meetings versus being apart. Um, One of the big concerns which leaders seem to have is, um, how will culture be managed virtually? And I was wondering if you have any thoughts around this. And this comes from the place that, as you spoke about a moment ago, people who are actually in positions of power have learned to do leadership, to do culture building, for lack of other more elegant words, you know, face to face. So there is, at this point, you know, we don't necessarily have a tried and tested, okay, this is how you build culture virtually successfully. Wondering if you have any ideas on what works.
No, absolutely. So first off, I just want to sort of set the table a little bit. I think there's two major dynamics going on. The first is that people who lead in organizations, they're basically. I think of this as market signals, in terms of the kinds of policies and descriptions of what they say they want workers to do. And you've said before, there's a range of use cases from people that absolutely want to be in the office tomorrow and people that never want to be in the office forever, and sort of everything in between. And so I think of this essentially as market signals, where a CEO will make a statement about what they want, and then they're waiting to see what the response from the workers is, and they're trying to thread the needle in many cases so that you actually don't upset either, or you at least make them all equally upset, in terms of what the future policies will be. So what I urge people who lead organizations to do is to be very transparent. I haven't lived through a global pandemic before. I don't think you have either. And so the more transparent you can be that we are all trying to co-create and figure this out as we go along is critical for people who lead organizations. Second is that we are co-creating these rules, and in a year, I can't tell you what I think your approach is going to be. And I don't think you can either. So instead, to think of it as a process. Your deliverable as somebody who leads an organization today is not the answer. It's not that this is the way we're going to operate. Only do that if you're okay that only some people are going to accept that that's the way it's going to be, and then others are going to leave. When Mr. Musk says, no, we're going back into the office to Tesla, what he's doing is he's essentially saying, and I'm okay if the rest of you quit, because that's the kind of person he is. If you want to be a more inclusive leader, if you want to be somebody who actually wants more people to be able to choose to stay with the organization, you're going to be more transparent, and you're going to treat it as a process of co-creation. So with that answer, then now, what about culture? So first off, I do suggest to many people who lead organizations, you may not know what your culture is. You may only know what you want your culture to be, because people who lead organizations are often reality distortion machines. They walk into a meeting and people behave in the way that they think that person wants them to behave, and then that person leaves the meeting and people go back to the way they were behaving before. And so it often, I say, first off, why don't you survey to find out what your culture is? I'll even give you a simple question. Stop 5 people in the hallway or on separate Zoom calls and ask them, what are the top 3 things you need to do in this organization to be successful? And if they say, keep your head down, do your work, and don't argue, you know what kind of culture you have. Oh, well, actually, what you'll probably get is 5 different answers. So that actually, I think, is one of the key takeaways for many people who lead organizations is you may not know exactly what your culture is, and it's probably not a very consistent culture if you're an organization of any size. So instead, if you think of it as a process, you think of it as a journey and continually trying to build a cohesive culture. Well, there's no question then that distributed work has made some of that more challenging. The answer is to be more intentional. If you used to do what Tom Peters and In Search of Excellence called management by walking around, which I call management by surveillance, if you used to feel that if you didn't see somebody working, they weren't working, and now you have to trust, well, then you need to be more intentional about how you communicate with others. You need to be more transparent. You need to be talking about the need to try to have people to all row their oars in the same direction and be aligned in delivering value for the organization stakeholders. All of those are tremendous opportunities to show how you can lead and manage. I call this guiding, being a team guide, in a different way in a post-pandemic world. Now, some people think that that's a tremendous opportunity, and others think that it's absolutely anathema. There's no way they want that world where they have to be that kind of involving and empathic leader. And I think that's a missed opportunity.
So, can I ask you, Gary, what are your thoughts around organizations where, there's a broad range of preferences, and uh, perhaps different opportunities based on business. What do you think of organizations having multiple formats for um, the workplace within the same organization? Some teams doing hybrid, some teams doing work on site, others doing largely remote. What are your thoughts around that?
So let's just do a thought experiment. So let's
Yeah.
say that you are somebody who leads a team, and I could wave a magic wand, and you had perfect information about the projects that the team is working on, the skills of each of the people on the team, their lived experience for the coming week or weeks,
Yeah.
the demands on their lives, potential challenges that are going on in their lives, and the strategic goals of the organization. You had perfect knowledge about that as well. So if you could have all of that information and the right tool set for how you could continually co-create the rules for the next week or two. Here's when we need to be together. Here's when we need to be apart. Here's what the workplace needs to look like when we are together. Here's the kinds of support that we need in terms of the technologies so that we keep staying aligned with each other. Here are the kinds of techniques that are going to be most useful to us as we go through problem solving in the next phase of our projects. If you had all that perfect information and all that perfect support, then you would have tremendous flexibility where every team could figure it out on an ongoing basis. Now, of course, many organizations don't have all those resources. They don't have that perfect information. So that's where I think there's a tremendous opportunity, is not to say, well, let's just bungee cord back to the way we used to do things and just shove everybody back into the office because that's how we used to be able to manage all this complexity. But instead, and especially in larger organizations with lots of different projects, lots of different kinds of business lines, and so on, the more you can empower workers to have the information and the tools that they need to make great decisions about where and when and how and why they should be doing work over the next couple of weeks and can continually iterate that, you're going to have a far more nimble and adaptive organization.
We have a really good question from Gotham. Hi, Gotham, and thank you for joining us. Gotham's question is this. Well, culture question is an excellent one, but a larger question for me is, given that Gen X and Gen Z do not crave stickiness in jobs, how important is culture in this new world? And Gotham's question or apprehension is perhaps shared, I think, quite widely. So, wondering what your thoughts are.
So, stickiness
Yeah.
may be a little more from the perspective of the employer than from the worker. So, and I don't know if I would immediately agree that Gen Y and Gen Z are just a flakier set of generations than anybody before. Again, I didn't grow up in a world with a digital distraction machine and in many cases, parents that were helicoptering me. So, not that I'm accusing any parents of having done that, but it's not uncommon in this era. And so then we suddenly shove them into the workforce and we expect them to have, a tremendous amount of stickiness. That is, they'll stick with their job for a good period of time. So I'll tell you a couple of insights that I've gained. The first is that this is a different generation in a lot of different ways. And a lot of it is simply the information about knowing what opportunities there are and the ability to have access to information so much more rapidly and to be able to solve more and more problems just in time and just in context. Now, that doesn't mean that I want my brain surgeon to have just watched a YouTube video and walk into the operating theater, but it does mean that a lot more work can be learned and developed and done well with shorter times to train and to be able to engage. Well, so it's perfectly understandable then that a young person would see, okay, I've done this project. Now I want to go off to this other project. And because they don't see the traditional loyalty that your parents and your grandparents might have had between the worker and the organization, then they have a perfectly understandable lack of loyalty or stickiness to an organization if they don't feel that it's giving them access to the kind of work that motivates them. Now, I do believe there needs to be a balance. I do believe we want to continually encourage younger workers to dive in, to find things that they're passionate about, to learn them deeply. And again, if we pair them with an older worker who really has understood that process. We can help them to learn that love of developing mastery. But I also think it puts a huge onus on the organization. If you are giving people access to work that is meaningful and interesting to them, if you're helping them to solve the kinds of problems that they feel they're most optimized to solve, you're going to keep those workers. And if you don't, if you see those workers as interchangeable, if you give them really, really rotten work to do, then it's perfectly understandable if that worker says, you know what, I'm out of here. I'm on to the next thing that might be more interesting for me.
Yeah, and actually that maps onto our own findings, our own research findings that people are asking far more questions. And the questions sound a little different from questions perhaps 20 years ago. So
Yeah.
it's not just about, uh, is it this job title and that compensation? But there are other questions around how does this weave into my life more broadly? And whether that's managing family, or whether that's, does this organization do work that supports the kind of world I want to make. In some ways it's more altruistic I would say than fairly narrow expectations, which I think many previous generations had. But here's one, Gary, which I'd love to hear your views around. A lot of learning, in the past at least, organizational learning happened through observation. So if I was a young person and I was ambitious, one of the easiest assignments was shadow ABC. She is so good at this. So, you're just going to learn a lot by observation. How do you think, I mean, is that even possible to do virtually?
Well, it's very dependent upon work roles, but I would say generally, absolutely, and it might be even easier because in the past, if it was a physical work location and you literally shadowed somebody by walking around, the more work that is done virtually or flexibly. I don't like the word hybrid that much. I think cars are hybrid. I don't think people are. But if work is done more flexibly, then you might actually have the opportunity to be able to shadow or learn from more people because you could be sitting in on Zoom calls. You could be involved in a range of different projects. And this is actually not uncommon with some Silicon Valley companies. They actually hire people more based on a profile, and then they have them engage with several different teams to find where the best fit would be. Google has been doing this for quite some time. And so I think it's actually more possible in this era. It just takes, again, more intentionality, more of a design process, and more of an understanding that we need to be able to give those young people the tools to be able to codify their learnings, to continually have access to learning, and to continually do that through mentorships and apprenticeships on an ongoing basis.
I love that you say that, Gary, because I mean, just this week, in many of the projects that we're on, um, we do hear a lot of senior leaders, their concerns are one, culture. Second, do people really get to know each other if they're all working,
Yeah.
in a distributed way? And the third is really around how will young people ever learn what they need for leadership roles if they're not present often enough in the office. And one leader I happened to speak to very candidly shared that at the end of the day, um, if you're really career oriented, if you're serious about reaching all the way to the top, then I wouldn't recommend you be anywhere but the office. So I
That sounds a little bit like the old rules of work to me. Here's what I'll say: is that person who has been learned that process and who themselves attained whatever level they did in the organization through that process, it's perfectly understandable they would have that bias. Now the part of it that I'll tease out of it is person to person interaction, the sort of random interconnections with other human beings and so on, no question, and certainly having others see you do your work. But I think that's a missed opportunity for many people who lead organizations to try to create many of the same opportunities in a more distributed organization, because that will give you broader access to a wider worker pool. If you are saying the only way you're going to be successful is if you come into the office, you're only going to have a certain profile of person doing that, and you're going to lose access to other workers that want more flexible work.
In your book, Gary, you speak about workplace as a co-working collaboration. I'm wondering how this insight influences, the design of the office of the future.
Well, certainly a lot of the designers and architects that we talk to, they're sort of flipping the model, the traditional model, the old rules of work that were unfortunately again built on an industrial era. And I know I sort of keep on saying this over and over again, but just think about it. I mean, you walked into an office and there were these massive cubicle farms, and then there were these tiny little things, called meeting rooms, and bigger things called executive offices, and so that kind of looks like a factory to me. I mean, it's got a lot of the similar characteristics, and so I think a lot of the leading thinkers on the design of the workplace are sort of, they've decided, yes, you have to flip it. That is, that the general spaces are about collaboration and co-creation, and then you need pods or places you can go off to be isolated and be thinking or work in smaller groups and so on. There's a marvelous approach that Autodesk has used called generative design, where they actually, to design a workplace, they take in input from a variety of different people, and then the software uses those parameters to actually lay out the building. Autodesk's facility in Toronto was actually designed using generative design. And what that gives you is an idea. Well, it all needs to be more flexible. You're going to see this in retail environments. More and more retail environments will be more like sort of designed like Lego sets, where things will be more flexible. I think more workplaces are going to be more like Lego sets, where you're going to have more of these elements that can be continually swapped around. If you go to Stanford's design school, the Hasso-Plattner School of Design, D School, you'll find that there's almost nothing tacked down. All the tables, all the chairs, all the boards, everything can move around because it gives you the opportunity to be able to continually create new collaboration spaces.
Very nice. So we come to the end of our conversation, Gary, and I'm wondering if there are, two or three messages you would have for people who are, and I'm not going to use the word leaders because I know in your book you speak about how everybody is, leading, so
Yeah.
so what would be some of the new rules for leading in, what is likely to be for many organizations a digital first organization?
Right. So I'll give you sort of two anchors that I try to suggest. The first is a mindset shift, because I talk a lot about mindset, skill set, and tool set. It's a mindset shift for people who lead. And that's this whole approach that instead of being the one with all the answers, you're the one with the best questions. My friend Esther Wojcicki, in her book Moonshots in Education, she says the teacher needs to shift from the sage on the stage to the guide on the side. And so I believe people who lead in organizations need to become more team guides, ones who are empowering groups of problem solvers. And then, so that's a mindset shift. And then the skill set shift is, I believe that those who lead organizations need the same skill set that I encourage workers to have. And I use the acronym of PACE: problem solvers who are adaptive, creative, and with empathy. And if there's any superpower that we know that those who lead organizations are going to need more and more in a post-pandemic world, it's empathy. As a matter of fact, Satya Nadella, CEO of Microsoft, quite recently said that he believes that the one human superpower that leads to innovation is empathy. And it's the ability to empathize with the needs of your coworkers, the needs of your customers, the needs of the planet, that is going to end up being one of the greatest superpowers of those who lead organizations.
Wow, thank you so much, Gary. I love the idea that it's a combination of very fundamental mindset shifts and the recognition that what we need from the future as skill sets is fundamentally different. The problem solving, the agility, the empathy, and empathy perhaps as the superpower for the future. So thank you so much.
Wonderful. No,
So
thank you, Shalini.
thank you, Gary. With that, we come to an end of our conversation today. I hope you enjoyed our podcast for today. Do stay tuned. This is episode 49 of our Future of Work show. And do reach out to us at Uncube, both for understanding more about how the world is shifting and what that means for leaders and organizations more generally. Also, reach out to us if, as an organization, you're wondering what some of these shifts mean for you, both in designing your future organization and in training leaders of the future. So, with that, thank you guys very much.